Hello, I'm back. So first, I want to talk about what you actually do. Your title, Location Strategy and Site Optimization. That's a thing. That's a job title I've never heard before. What is your role within Facebook?
Sure. So I spend a lot of time helping Facebook be thoughtful about where we grow. So where we grow helps not only us, but the local communities as well. Any large portion of that is spent on housing.
So what does that mean, though? You're like building the plans, you're doing policy work, you're doing politics. Like what's your day-to-day composed of?
Sure. So yes to all of that. When you think of how and where you want to grow a company, the topics that come to mind are: where's the talent? Where are the schools? What type of degrees and students are the schools producing? Is it the right mix for the type of employees you need to run your business? Can the employees afford to live nearby? Is the region have interest in scaling the infrastructure to support the new job growth? All of that.
So let's do the location analysis for Facebook headquarters. Like you were sitting there right on the bay, you're drawing the circle around. What are the problems and opportunities you see there?
It's actually a great question. When we started growing in Menlo Park, the home prices were half of what they are now. That was back 2011 or so.
Just a coincidence, I suppose.
We're willing to own that we contribute to the problem, but this is 40 years in the making, and it's actually a really serious issue, and to put it on the back of us entirely, I think, does a disservice to the solutions that are going to be needed to actually move the needle. And what has happened in that time frame is, you pick your geographic area, but approximately for every new home that was produced, we saw 8 or 10 new jobs created. And you scale that over decades, and you end up with a massive supply-demand imbalance. And that's why right now, you go back to 2000, the supply deficit of housing is around 700,000 units. That would be San Francisco, Oakland, and a half of a new San Jose that we would have to build to get to the point where median income can afford a medium-priced home.
Wow. So when you look at a problem that's that big, particularly framed in that way, what do you do? Like, what do you use Facebook's considerable but not 700,000 housing units worth of resources? Where do you target your investment?
The way we've gone about it is to partner with local communities to figure out what are the solutions. And we truly believe that we alone cannot and should not solve this problem. There's been an interesting dynamic with, because tech does have a lot of resources, we really take it to heart that it's incumbent on us to listen to and honor our local community partners and to enable them to implement their solutions. And the way that's manifested itself super tactically, our first affordable housing fund that we launched in 2016 was in partnership with 2 local cities and 5 different community groups. And the San Francisco Foundation joined us as well to launch a fund that funds projects that the community decided was important to them. And I think that is our model. We hope to scale it. We've launched the Partnership for the Bay's Future since then, which again is cross-sector, philanthropy, civil society, employers, and most importantly, the public sector. We can fund all we want, but if the public sector is not going to approve the housing, then game over.
How do you think about getting that housing approved? I mean, you guys have considerable political muscle, particularly in the places where you have businesses. Like, what are you doing to actually to push the city councils, particularly in the smaller cities in the peninsula, to get behind your housing agenda?
That's been really tough. One thing we have, first of all, at the state level, we've been very active. We were the only tech company in 2017 to support SB 35. And back as far as 2016, when we were trying to hold convenings to bring our peers to the table, it was a pretty lonely spot. No one wanted to join, and since then we've seen measurable progress. Google's done amazing announcements. Microsoft and Genentech, our peers, are stepping up. And I think we're going to see more support at the state level, although May was a disastrous month for housing policy in California. Still recovering from that. At the local level, we're really focused on, it's interesting, we have an employee pool that, despite what you hear in the media, is representative of all different income levels. It could be more representative, and we're working on that. But they have a voice, and we can help them state their opinions. And part of that is overcoming a stigma that I'm a tech worker and that I'm not necessarily welcomed. And our objective is to create a narrative where everyone is welcome and everyone's diverse viewpoints are welcomed and they can have a civil discourse. So I think where we're focused on is increasing the voices in the policy realm. And then we also have, that's internal focus. External focused, I'm super proud of an initiative we began 2 years ago with UC Berkeley, it's called Y Plan, where the professors at UC Berkeley partnered with high school students in Menlo Park and East Palo Alto to help them envision, gather data, run surveys of what they feel their community should look like from a housing perspective. And they came up with a series of solutions, and they presented it to the local city councils, and we're hopeful those type of policies now become embedded or provide a roadmap for what might be considered to be adopted in the future. So again, grassroots participation in the process.
When you look out across the other tech companies that are starting to do things, you mentioned Microsoft and Google, who's not on board? Who's not being helpful or actively frustrating?
You're asking me to out our... I'd love to see Apple and Amazon join us.
That would be good. What do you see out of local leadership within, particularly the peninsula, but all across the Bay? Where do you see the local city councils and mayors doing good work?
I think the big cities are doing amazing work, and they also, frankly, have a lot to work with. They have transit infrastructure and whatnot. And where we're seeing the struggle on a number of fronts are in the smaller cities that don't necessarily have even the resources, like the staffing resources, to implement creative policy. And when we see a lot of grant processes and whatnot be put out there to help increase capacity, they're often targeted at optimizing impact. And if you're thinking of impact in terms of number of new housing units, the smaller cities have a hard time competing against San Jose or an Oakland or San Francisco. So I think we have some work to do there in how we define impact. And then I think the electorate is just really challenging in the small cities because as it's like this self-fulfilling prophecy, as the supply-demand imbalance of housing worsens, then those who own homes in the smaller cities where there's generally a lower density housing stock, it starts to look more and more the same, and they vote in a certain way. And so how do you get a city council that can reflect what its the people who voted to put them in place are saying, but at the same time are acting in the interest of all of society?
Do you think there's anything about the way that people inside Facebook think that generates interesting housing ideas inside the company? Do you think that the emphasis on analytics and optimization that seems to cut across the way that Facebook works has led you to think differently about housing policy since you came into the company?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I would say the reverse. I'm very versed, and our team is very versed in data analytics, and I can talk data all day. I'm a super nerd, as are a lot of my coworkers. We're proud of that. What it's made me focus more on is just the pure human impact of the housing crisis. It's devastating. And if anything, our solutions where we typically land is we don't know the answer. And who should we be talking to find the answers? And it's generally not within Facebook. It's our local communities who are themselves the experts, and it's incumbent on policymakers and large employers to ship. This is why we partnered with local community in our Catalyst Housing Fund to begin tipping the balance to be not so disproportionately focused on those in power, like informal power.
What's your relationship with Zuckerberg and their housing initiatives?
So we're separate. Chan Zuckerberg Initiative is the personal foundation, a philanthropic entity of Mark and Priscilla.
Right.
And we're Facebook, the company. So clearly we share ideas and we're thought partners, but we're separate and distinct. And we partnered on the Partnership for the Bay's Future. We're a founding member there. They were a large, the driver behind that, along with other philanthropies and other companies. So we're partners.
I bet this audience wants to ask you some questions. Let's go right here. There's a mic speeding around.
Thank you. I'm Karen Clopton. I'm a Human Rights Commissioner here in San Francisco. And I am concerned about black out-migration from San Francisco, from East Palo Alto, Menlo Park, et cetera, and how Facebook is addressing that. So that's my first question. The second one is a question I had earlier about what are you doing to educate the workforce about the history of racism in housing in the U.S., which didn't begin 40 years ago. It began 80 years ago.
Yep.
And white people, I have noticed, those who are so-called, self-proclaimed or whatever, differentiated in that way, seem very unaware of their the origins, and they might mention redlining, or they might have a vague idea about it. Also, the immigrant worker population really has no idea of the concerted, institutionalized efforts to segregate housing. So I have those two questions, and I would love to hear what you have to say about that.
Yeah, I think that that's a fantastic question and great points. I think, what is the corporate responsibility to address these historical legacies of segregation, discrimination, bad loans, red line? You could just go on and on, as you noted, for decades.
So we are addressing we're addressing what is in place now, as opposed to we weren't here 80 years ago to stem the tide then, which isn't to say we wouldn't have done anything if we were here. But when we think of, so maybe we can start with the first question.
Sure.
Which is, what are we doing about, you mentioned black out migration. And when we address housing, we call the 3 Ps become our motto, our religion that we live by. And I've spoken today mostly about producing new housing, but we equally focus on protecting those who are currently housed and preserving the existing affordable housing stock. And that's where we have really deep programs, especially in the city of East Palo Alto, and then the east side of Menlo Park, which is historically a black neighborhood.
And what kind of results have you gotten from those latter components of the program?
That's a future white paper that we should write. So part of our framework, we support tenant access to tenant services, tenant protection services. And the data there is pretty stark. If you have access to representation, your chances of actually being evicted are drastically much less. But we don't have the data on that per se. New York is into that heavily right now, so we're clearly not the only ones thinking about that. On the preservation front, that's been a super interesting arena to play in. For example, our Catalyst Housing Fund there's naturally occurring affordable housing. There's a lot of affordable housing that's affordable, that's not deed restricted, right? So it's at risk of going to market rate. So we just funded a project in North Fair Oaks. It's a super sad story. It was a building kind of in disrepair. A private equity fund came in, evicted the tenants, rehabbed it, and then backfilled it with rents that our workers can't afford to pay. So a local partner decided the St. Francis Center, buy it back, put a stake in the ground. We're taking our community back. So we helped finance that project, and now those units will be turned over to affordable units in perpetuity forever. So that's a great example of preserving what was there. That doesn't necessarily solve the problem of we still need more supply, because we're only going to increase the need to preserve if we don't also produce. So that's a super long-winded answer to your first question. The second...
Let's answer the second one
briefly.
offline. Let's try to get one more in.
So I'm Karen Pierce. I'm a native San Franciscan and fortunately bought my house in 1980. So I'm able to still live here. Okay. I'm a native. About 10 years ago, I was planning to put in an in-law apartment because we had a housing crisis. I chose not to do that because I cannot be a person who accepts the rents that are now being paid, okay? I can't be part of that. So what we've heard today is wonderful, but a lot of very facile answers to questions. How do we protect the most vulnerable? The first panel all said by voting. Who's the most disenfranchised? It's the most vulnerable, okay? So that's one thing. Your explanation about, and I'm getting to a question, your explanation about it's not all the fault of tech, but in fact it is the fault of tech because people like me were out there going to our elected officials and saying, here's the consequence, okay? It is not an unintended consequence of tech moving here because we notified our elected officials what was going to happen. And in fact, capitalism that somebody brought up is what controls, and so we've been ignored. I'm at many tables. And yes, I am also on the menu because no matter what I say, I'm ignored, okay? So I want to know from you and from the other folks who've been up here, right, what can you really commit to address these rather than agreeing with us and continuing to do what you're doing?
Great points. And to clarify, tech has absolutely contributed to the problem. But we're not the only ones who can solve it. And it started long before us. And we need to deal with that, to your question as well. There's a lot of context that we need to unpack to find solutions. And Facebook has absolutely, we're not just the agreeers. We were one of the first doers supporting legislation to help find solutions going back to the first housing package in 2017. We've partnered with our 5 local community groups and cities to launch our affordable housing fund to actually build new housing. A third of that fund, by the way, is for 0 to 30% area median income, which is the homeless. We've worked with, again, the local high schoolers to envision what they believe the policy should be to create a roadmap for local policymakers. We have a housing preservation fund to preserve housing in our backyard that's naturally occurring affordable. We are supporting access to tenant rights counseling for local neighbors. We have a teacher housing pilot fund because one of the gaps in the current housing system is the missing middle. Affordable housing traditionally does not serve everyone. You can still make 80% of area median income and not anywhere near afford housing. And you would end up paying way more than a third of your income towards rent. So we have a pilot program that's enabled school districts in our local area to actually fill the vacancies of teachers so that students don't have to have round robin of substitute teachers every week because there's not a teacher who can't afford to live there. And there's more that we have going as well. So I appreciate your question deeply. You're absolutely right that we can't just say yes, we do have to step up to the table. We will certainly be doing more in this space. I'm very optimistic that our peers will be doing more in this space. And I'd also like to put out a call to action that we shouldn't be doing this alone. I'm confident that there's a belief that tech should not be deciding the world order. We certainly should not be deciding the world order in housing, and we need to be doing that at the hip with local community. The public sector absolutely has to step up because they approve the housing. other philanthropies, other employers. So it really is a cross-sector effort. And at the end of the day, it is not just about housing, it's about social mobility. Silicon Valley has been one of the greatest generators of social mobility historically, and we've lost that because we haven't invested in the infrastructure that supports new job growth. So at some point, we need to return to a point where spawning new jobs that everyone has access to, that are good paying jobs, and we can afford to live in a region, then we all win. We can't even have that discussion yet because we're stuck in solving housing.
That's all the time we have. Thank you so much, Micah. Thank you for your tough questions.